perspectives on the race and crime relationship. And so for this week, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about theory. So it's kind of like taking the theory class that you've taken previously, and rather than talking about crime causation specifically, we're going to talk about why there's differences in crime across race and ethnicity. So from last time, what we found was that based on, for example, UCR, even NCDS data, is that different racial ethnic groups are overrepresented in particular crimes. But we're talking about homicide specifically, right? Talk about homicide, which is widely regarded as the most serious criminal offense that one can commit. We know that there's really drastic differences in homicide and homicide victimization across race and gender as well. And so when we look at race specifically across males, we see that compared to white males, African American males are 10 times more likely to be the victim of a homicide, whereas compared to white males, Latino or Hispanic males are 2 times more likely to be the victim of a homicide. So we see drastic differences in homicide victimization across race and ethnicity. And so the question is, what explains this gap, right? What's the reason why we see higher rates of homicide victimization for both African Americans and Hispanics relative to whites? So one thing we have to point out is that race itself is a proxy, right? What does that mean, race is a proxy? Well, what it means in this context is that race is probably being substituted for something else, right? There's something that's correlated or that goes with race that likely explains this gap or differences in homicide victimization across race and ethnicity. Now, it's true that depending on your race, average or statistically speaking, you are more likely to grow up in different types of neighborhoods, right? Have different levels of education, different levels of employment or employment earnings, right? So we know in U.S. society that your race does matter, right? In terms of at least how you are born or your starting point in life, that does matter. That can probably explain some of the differences here. And so that's what we're going to try to get at today and this week, is trying to explain what are the differences and what are the mechanisms that explain racial differences in crime, specifically homicide. Okay. This is really hard to see. You don't have to write this down. But the first question is, what is a theory? Right? We talk about theory all the time, but what does it really mean? What's the definition of a theory? So the definition I've written out here, again, it's hard to see. I'm sorry. The blue and red ink looks a lot better on computer screens than it does actually right here. But here it says scientific theories instead of interconnected statements or propositions that explain how 2 or more events or factors are related to one another. So in theory sense, what we're typically want to explain is a causal relationship, right? Usually a causal relationship between X and Y. So when we see here in blue, it says 2 or more events or factors, that's usually talking about X and Y, right? What's the cause and what's the effect? Now the other part, interconnected statements or propositions, is really just talking about how are they related. Okay, how are you saying that X causes Y? Are you saying more of X causes more Y, or more of X leads to a decrease or negative effect on Y, right? What's that relationship? And that's what interconnected statements or propositions is getting at. So if you take another theory in criminology, self-control theory, which I really like because it's pretty straightforward, easy to explain. The X and Y relationship is first, the cause is self-control, and then the outcome or effect is criminal offending, right, or crime. So based on self-control theory, right, we would say more self-control, less likelihood of engaging in criminal behavior, or vice versa, right? If you have less self-control, then you have a higher probability of engaging in crime. And self-control is a really, really strong causal variable based on research studies on different phenomenon, we see that self-control is actually one of the strongest predictors of crime. And so we're talking about theory this week. We're going to talk about two types, two paradigms related to theory. Right? We're going to talk first today about biological theories, and then we'll talk about sociological explanations on Thursday, focusing on things like social structure or other societal or environmental causes of crime. All right. So let's first, just for today, talk about biological theories of crime. So, admittedly, right, talking about biology, talking about genes or genetic factors, has historically been considered taboo in criminology. Right? We don't like to talk a lot about biology or genes in criminology, but in recent years, genetic factors, at least as it relates to crime or criminal offending, has been given more recognition, a little bit more acceptance, not a lot, but a little bit more acceptance in the field. But I would argue how we think about genetic factors today is much different than how we used to talk about it back then, especially during the time of Lombroso. Right, so one of the first theories we're going to talk about, or ideas, is Cesare Lombroso's idea of phrenology. So Lombroso himself was an Italian doctor in the late 1800s for the Italian army. And his whole idea was to use phrenology to study the link not only between individuals and criminal behavior, but race and criminal behavior as well. And phrenology itself, it's the idea that one's skull size or shape of one's skull or head can possibly determine whether or not this person is a criminal or not. So what Lombroso argued was that people who had larger skull bones or asymmetrical facial features had a higher rate of criminal involvement. And Lombroso, because he was talking about these things being tied to genetic factors, he made the argument that criminals were born, not made. Right? Again, this whole concept, what he called biological determinism, that based on your genes and how those genes influence the size of your skull, or whether or not your skull or facial features are symmetrical or not, that can determine whether or not you're involved in crime. And I'll go back to this last quote here in a minute. But since Lombroso himself was focused on Italy, right, this is where he did his research, this is where he collected his data. This is what he had to say about those Italians living in the southern states of Italy, specifically Sicilia and Sardinia. He says the frequency of homicide, I wrote that 2 times, the frequency of homicide in Calabria, Sicilia, and Sardinia is fundamentally due to African and Oriental elements. Right? So again, he's here talking also about race, specifically how people in these southern states have darker skin tones, maybe more of African heritage, and that explains their greater tendency for violence. So this is written in the late 1800s by Lombroso. But does anyone know why do we consider him the father of criminology? How is this one guy who's talking about skull sizes, talking about phrenology, which has now been proven to be junk science, right? There's no causal or scientific validity to it. Why is he considered the father of criminology? Anyone ever heard that or know that he's the father of criminology? Any ideas? No, never been explained prior classes. He's not from the classical school. He's from the positivism school. Yeah, but that does, relate to it. Right? So before Lombroso's time, we used to think of criminals as people who were born immoral. Maybe they were people who were not religious enough, for example. Well, Lombroso himself kind of contradicted that and said, no, it's not due to your religious affiliation or whether or not you go to church. It's due to biology. But when talking about him as a father of criminology, he altered how we studied crime. So, as I mentioned previously, how Lombroso would study chronology is he would actually collect data, right? He would take measurements of people's skulls, right? The size of their heads, whether or not they were symmetrical or not. He collected real life data. And even though that data wasn't any good and his arguments weren't any good, he still collected data in anticipation to explain criminal behavior. And that's what we do today, right? We still do today, right? Anytime we make any arguments in papers, when we're trying to study crime, we have to collect some data to back up our arguments, right? And that's what Lombroso attempted to do, is collect data to explain his argument. Now, late 1800s, early 1900s, Lombroso's idea of biology and how that relates to criminal behavior really took hold here in the United States and led to what's known as the eugenics movement. So I want to play a quick 5-minute video that talks about the eugenics movement here in the US, how the idea of biology and bad genes, how that influenced how many Americans thought of new immigrant groups and blacks during the early 1900s, and the policy results that came about in the eugenics movement. So let me play a quick video on this.
Science polarization about unlettered, untutored, relatively uneducated peoples coming in large numbers, the sense that disease was a problem, all of these worries were amalgamated into a belief that immigrants caused these problems, and thus immigration should be held down. Many white Protestant Americans came to fear they were about to be outnumbered and outbred by the newcomers and their offspring, that they were being replaced. They embraced a new pseudoscience born in Britain called eugenics, which falsely claimed, with no evidence, that everything from poverty to prostitution, disabilities to what they called feeble-mindedness, could be eliminated if the individuals they dismissed as socially defective could be stopped from reproducing. I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. And when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized, and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them. Theodore Roosevelt.
The idea was that the bad people have to stop reproducing and the good people need to reproduce more. Negative eugenics says sterilize the wrong people, snuff them out. And that's the eugenics that the Nazis would pick up on.
Colleges and universities taught eugenics. Medical societies confirmed it. Clergymen preached it. John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie funded it. And some of the most prominent people in America championed it. Margaret Sanger, Alexander Graham Bell, even Helen Keller.
It seems to me that the simplest, wisest thing to do would be to submit cases like that of the malformed idiot baby to a jury of expert physicians. If the evidence were presented openly and the decisions made public before the death of the child, there would be little danger of mistakes or abuses. We must decide between a fine humanity and a cowardly sentimentalism.
33 of the 48 states would eventually enact eugenics laws mandating the forced sterilization of wards of the state deemed physically or mentally unfit. People in prisons, hospitals, and asylums.
More than 60,000 Americans would be sterilized without their consent before the last of these statutes was removed from the books in 2014. Eugenics also provided a racist rationale for those convinced immigration needed to be drastically curtailed.
Man of the old stock is being crowded out of many country districts by these foreigners, just as he is today being literally driven off the streets of New York City by the swarms of Polish Jews. These immigrants adopt the language of the American. They wear his clothes, they steal his name, and they are beginning to take his women. But they seldom adopt his religion or understand his ideals. And while he's being elbowed out of his own home, the American looks calmly abroad and urges on others the suicidal ethics which are exterminating his own race. Madison Grant.
Madison Grant was a widely admired conservationist, a friend of presidents, a founder of the Bronx Zoo, responsible in part for saving the California redwoods and preserving the buffalo, and instrumental in creating Glacier, Denali, and Everglades national parks.
And he was also a violent anti-Semite and a violent anti-Italian. And he really was horrified by what he saw happening on the streets of New York. So he publishes a book called The Passing of the Great Race, in which he puts forward the idea that nationalities have eugenic characteristics. He fills it with all sorts of interesting historical so-called data, which is mostly crazy, but it's very persuasive, and it does give the anti-immigration movement, it suddenly gives them science. Science says if we let them in, then they're going to destroy the American gene pool.
For Grant and many others, Jews were a distinct race, not considered white, dismissed as uncouth Asiatics. Grant's supposedly scientific claims about a rigid hierarchy of races was ludicrous. The biological notion of race itself is a fiction. But his ideas caught the imagination of those Americans already opposed to immigration.
People tended to increasingly view nationalities as if they were breeds or species. To liken nationalities to breeds was a fundamental categorical mistake.
So the ideas behind not just Lombroso's work, but other people like Charles Darwin, for example, really played or had a profound impact on U.S. society, right? Especially during a time when there's mass immigration coming from places where traditionally or before that period we had never experienced immigration from. And so these biological arguments were made scientifically, so to speak, right, to influence public policy to stop immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So after the 1930s, and especially after World War II, because we know with the Nazis and the Nazi Party, founded on this idea of eugenics and a superior race to commit atrocities, not just in Germany, but all across Europe, right? After that period of time, the idea of biology or linking genes with race really started to go down. And since that time, there's only been a few studies that have tried to use biology or genes to explain the race and crime relationship. And many of those studies focus on intelligence, right? It's basically saying that there are biological differences or determinants of intelligence, and it's intelligence that plays a role in predicting crime. So since that time, there's been a couple of books that have come out. They try to use biology and differences in intelligence to explain racial and ethnic differences in criminal offending. So the first book, came out in 1985 by James Q. Wilson and Richard Herrnstein. You never heard of any of these individuals before. James Q. Wilson was the one who invented the theory of broken windows, right? I'm sure you've probably heard of that before. So broken windows theory was coined by James Q. Wilson. And so in their book, Crime and Human Nature, they try to explain why there's differences in violence or crime between blacks and whites. Right? They're just focused on blacks and whites primarily. And they offer these three, what they call constitutional factors or rationales, reasons why there's differences in crime between blacks and whites. Right, again, these are not my arguments. These are Wilson and Bernstein. And so one of the arguments is that blacks tend to be more mesomorphic or muscular than white males. And that explains why black males specifically have higher rates of violence or criminal offending. Their whole argument here is that testosterone, for example, which is a fundamental ingredient to muscle building, and testosterone in prior research has been shown to lead to more aggressive behavior. Right? That's their argument. What they also argue, as another constitutional factor, is that blacks have more psychological disorders than whites, which explains their higher level of cerebral involvement. And then that blacks also score more on IQ tests. And the last one is very pivotal, because even today, criminologists will recognize that intelligence or things like academic failure or dropping out of school is related to criminal behavior, right? There's been a lot of research studies that find that people who are not attached to school, who drop out of school, have higher rates of juvenile delinquency and criminal activity. So this book came out in 1985, and again focuses on these three constitutional factors for why blacks are more likely than whites to engage in criminal behavior. Oh. All right. Now, 9 years later, Richard Bernstein and Charles Murray follow up Crime and Human Nature by publishing this book called The Bell Curve. And the reason why they call it the bell curve is because intelligence or IQ is one of these unique things that's normally distributed in society, right? So if you take a random sample of the population and you collect their IQ or have them take IQ tests and you plot them on a graph, this is what it will look like, a nice normal curve, right? So intelligence, when we're thinking about it, most of us are here in the middle, right? We have average levels of intelligence. If you go to Stephen F. Austin, you probably have lower levels of intelligence over here. And then there's a few of us that have really high levels of intelligence, score really, really high on IQ. Right? So IQ is normally distributed, right? With the majority of us, again, here in the middle, some in the lower end, and some in the upper end. And so with this book, The Bell Curve, Bernstein and Charles Murray talk about intellectual determinism. So their argument here is that your level of IQ intelligence really predicts how well you're going to do in social life, right? Not only whether or not you're involved in criminal behavior, but also whether or not you're employed, whether you live below the poverty level, whether you have illegitimate children or what they call children out of wedlock, or are dependent on welfare or food stamps. Right? This is their argument that IQ itself is really going to be a significant predictor of all these different factors in life and whether or not you're successful or not successful. So I've already mentioned, right, the link between IQ and crime is this idea of school failure, right? People who drop out of school, people who are not attached to school or not attached to their teachers, for example, or who don't value getting an education, might have higher levels of criminal behavior. But there's also this other argument, is that people with low IQ will have a hard time figuring out or understanding how crime, especially criminal victimization, hurts other people. So for most people, when you ask them, hey, would you go out and commit a robbery? Most people would say no, right? Right? Hope so. But the majority, when they explain the reason why they wouldn't commit a robbery, most of them are not afraid of getting caught, right? That's not, I mean, yeah, that's a worry, that's a dilemma, but that's not the biggest one. The biggest one's going to be, it's not right. Right? It's not right to go out and put a gun in someone's face and demand their purse, their phone, or other monetary possession. And so the argument Bernstein and Murray is saying is that people with low IQ just can't fathom the ethical principles or moral dilemma that crime causes. Tying it back to race, they said intelligence itself is highly tied to biology, highly tied to different racial and ethnic groups. And this time they argue that blacks and Latinos in both of those groups have the lowest IQ levels, followed by whites, and then Asians with the highest IQ or intelligence. So again, right, these are not my arguments, the arguments of Bernstein and Murray's. So the question is, where's the limitation to that? The first one that comes to mind is that your intelligence may not be indicative of your race, but your social class. Or maybe other stuff affects or matters as well, right? Maybe immigrant status as well. My dad's from Mexico, for example. And he can read English. He's been in the United States for a very long time, longer than I've been alive, obviously. But I couldn't really ask my dad to tutor me, to read to me, or to help me out with my homework, right? Also, my mom was not college educated. I remember when I was in high school trying to apply for colleges, and really she didn't have much knowledge about the college application process. She didn't know about FAFSAs and signing up for scholarships and things like that. I mean, don't get me wrong, they cared about my education. They did it a lot, but in other ways, they couldn't help me out in terms of tutoring and education, stuff like that. And also, what about differences in community or schools? When I was moving from Florida back to Texas, and my wife and I were trying to figure out, okay, where in this general area are we going to live? Her number one thing was the quality of schools. Where are the neighborhoods with the highest quality of schools? And that was the number one determining factor for where we live now, where we eventually bought a house. And we do know, right, that there's differences in communities, right? Communities are not created equal, and the schools within those communities are all different, have different levels of funding, have different levels of resources, have different levels of attachment to the school, right? So your community does matter, and the quality of the school you attend matters. And that, again, is highly driven by your race. Also, what do intelligence tests really measure? What are they getting at? It's really hard to fathom, right? When you think about intelligence, you think about IQ, there's so many different types of IQ, right? For me, my strength is writing, right? I write a lot for this job. That's usually what I'm doing when I'm not teaching. I'm in my office, I'm writing. But my concept of self-control, I'm blanking on when you're like really quick, like thinking of something, blanking on it. I had it in my mind. My wife's really good at it. Common sense, I'm sorry. Common sense. Common sense. Mine is a little. It's a work in progress. Let's say that. So I know like there'll be some times where we'll go to IKEA and we'll bring home some furniture to put together, and I'll be there, like I'm putting it together, and my wife's just like standing back there and just looking, and she's like, "That doesn't look right." Right? She has really, really good common sense. Anytime we try to do some like home improvement stuff in our house, I leave it to her. She's just better than me at it. Right? Now, when it comes to writing, like I'm much better than my wife. Like my wife is terrified to write an email, right? So usually she'll write it, or she'll ask me to help her write it and approve it before she sends it out. Right? So we have different strengths, definitely. And also the IQ tests are not very, very good. I never scored high on my SAT, my ACT, or when I was going to graduate school, GRE. I was never that good, right? I always scored lower than the 25 or 25th percentile. So it's really a question about what are these IQ tests really getting at? What types of intelligence? And I'll tell you in our field, in criminology, some professors, there's some people that are really freaking smart. Really, really, really smart. But you ask them to go talk to other people, have conversations, especially conversations with other professors, other staff across campus, they just can't do it. They just can't do it, right? They're really smart in what they do, and really smart at doing research, sitting behind a computer. But you ask them to go have a conversation with someone, anyone, they just can't do it, right? They don't have that type of intelligence. So intelligence itself, how we measure it, how we define it, really varies. And then finally, is the notion of white-collar crime. White-collar crime is typically the offenders are people who have achieved the American dream. These are people who, in our eyes, have been successful and they're very smart. They're often college educated. So we think of them as having high IQ. Well, why is it that they engage in criminal behavior themselves, right? Intelligence or IQ is really as strong as a predictor as we would think of it. Why is there white-collar criminals? All right. Anyone know who this guy is? Ever seen him before in your life? All right. So I'm having out note cards again. That matters too. Something else that's really popular in that field is exposure to lead. Right? What happens when you're exposed to lead? Does anyone know? What's the negative consequence when you're exposed to lead? Cancer. Cancer could be one. Yeah. Anything else? Messes up your brain, right? It inhibits your prefrontal cortex, which really, what they say, controls your IQ, a lot of your functioning. And so the idea is that people who are exposed to lead, it inhibits their brain development and can lead to criminal behaviors or engaging in crime, right? So there's been some research on that from a biosocial standpoint. So the way I would leave it off is that biosocial criminology, I think they've kind of made a point that biology and genes matter as well, but it's also how these factors interact with the environment. And people who study this A lot of times they get labeled as racist, and I think that's totally unfair. Instead, what I think it brings to the field is just different perspectives and different ways to study crime, right? We know that, as we'll talk about today, right, your community matters, where you grow up, whether it's you're exposed to poverty, racial discrimination. Yes, that can matter in terms of whether or not you engage in crime. But there's other factors that matter too, and some of these other factors could be the role of genes or biological indicators as well. Let me shift. So I forgot to mention this is totally not related to this class, but for our department, I'm one of the ones that's in charge of scheduling. And most of you, if not all of you here, are seniors. This is probably your last semester, or maybe you have one more semester after this. And so the question I just want to ask very generally, right? I'm not going to talk about this outside of class, is whether or not do you ever have any issues like scheduling classes, you're trying to. So last on Tuesday we were talking about biology and how biology may or may not explain racial and ethnic differences in criminal behavior. And so for today, we'll focus on what's known as social structure, right? We're really talking about people's environment, right? Exposure to poverty or exposure to different norms and values and how that might explain racial and ethnic differences in crime. So, first theory we're going to talk about is social disorganization theory. And the first one here is W.E.B. Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, which came out in 1899. So this was a book written at the turn of the 20th century by W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African American to graduate from Harvard, and he actually spent years living in a Philadelphia neighborhood called the Seventh Ward. It was predominantly home to African Americans living in Philadelphia during that time. And so, in studying this Philadelphia neighborhood, what Du Bois explained is that black criminality or black involvement in crime is due to racial and discriminatory practices and poor living conditions. And so I just want to play a quick video talking about that study.
Almost every major city has multiple monuments to lives lost in military conflicts, but you almost never see memorials to the lives saved thanks to medical or public health breakthroughs.
Sorry. Great, but it's not working.
Almost every major city has multiple monuments to lives lost in military conflicts, but you almost never see memorials to the lives saved thanks to medical or public health breakthroughs. This little plaque commemorating the work of W.E.B. Du Bois is the exception. Now, Du Bois is famous today for his work as a sociologist and a political activist, but he was also an unappreciated pioneer in the study of human health, thanks to work that he did in the 1890s here in Philadelphia's 7th Ward. Du Bois was an aspiring sociologist and also something of a prodigy. He was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. And at the time, he was reading this openly racist academic literature that portrayed African Americans as intrinsically unhealthy or criminal. But Du Bois was determined to delve deeper into the problem using data. The opportunity arose when he was invited to study Philadelphia's 7th Ward. an area with a large African American community, ravaged by poverty, crime, and high child mortality. The white establishment framed these very real problems in racist terms, pointing to alleged deficiencies in African Americans. Du Bois moved to Philadelphia, took on the task of documenting the social and health problems of the Seventh Ward. One of the key questions he wanted to answer was why life expectancy in the Seventh Ward was so low. He spent countless hours exploring this neighborhood, visited over 2,000 homes, interviewing their occupants, surveying their living conditions, poring over documents in the library, and amassing a mountain of information. With this data, Du Bois created this extraordinary color-coded map of the Seventh Ward, documenting all the homes and dividing them up into different economic classes. And what the data revealed was very telling. 87% of residents had no access to an indoor toilet. Almost none had hot water. And overcrowding was rife, with as many as 10 people living in a single room. To make matters worse, landlords were charging higher rents to Black residents, exacerbating their poverty along with their poor health. It all combined to mean that in Philadelphia, the likelihood of a Black child dying before the age of 15 was twice that of a white child. Du Bois published that data and the map in a groundbreaking book. It painted a picture of what today we would call systemic racism. If the life expectancy of African Americans was going to improve, the entire environment and economic system around them was going to have to be changed. Du Bois wrote, "The most difficult social problem is the peculiar attitude of the nation towards the well-being of the race. There have been few other cases in the history of civilized people where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference." Du Bois proved that the health problems in the Seventh Ward weren't caused by some natural inferiority, but rather that the system itself was rigged to shorten Black lives. Hi, I'm Stephen Johnson.
All right. So early 1900s, as we were talking about last time in that context, the idea was that certain groups had these issues because of bad genes or different genetic factors. But what Du Bois is arguing, that it was the social conditions of the communities where certain people lived, in this case African Americans. It was the social conditions that contributed to problems like crime, infant mortality, other negative health behavior. And also, what you have to keep in mind is that there are racial and discriminatory laws going on during this time, right? The blacks that lived in the Seventh Ward didn't choose to live there, but that's where they were placed because of laws forbidding where they could live in Philadelphia during that time. And when you think about something like racial segregation, right, we often assume that all the bad things associated with race and racial discrimination only happen in the South. But when you think about racial segregation was actually higher in the North and in Northeast cities like Philadelphia than it was in the South, right? So even in these northern cities where you had a lot of African Americans fleeing the South, fleeing violence, even when they arrived in places like Philadelphia, they were still discriminated against and still faced these uphill battles. So early 1900s, right? Du Bois's ideas that someone's social conditions matter in terms of their involvement in crime, they didn't really get a lot of support. As we mentioned last time, eugenics was something that was highly emphasized during that time. But later, in the 1920s, 1930s, we had the Chicago Sociology Department to really start examining the social conditions of one's community and how that matters for criminal behavior. And during the early 1900s, they focused on Chicago, and some of the early work by Sean McKay emphasized what's known as a concentric zone approach. So have you ever seen this? You know, this is the concentric zone, right? So it's this idea, based on the work of their workers came up with, is that most cities can be plotted like this, right? Where you have these concentric circles. And in the very middle here, you have what's known as the Central Business District. These are places where you tend to have warehouses, you have factories, various businesses. And it's kind of like the epicenter of the city, right? This is where the economic hub of the city is located. And then in the zone right after, you have the transitional zone. In the transitional zone, there you have, some poor people or the poorest of the people living in the city. And then you have really bad housing and most importantly, higher rates of crime. But then as you move out, right, as you move out to the outer zones, social conditions get better, communities improve, and crime goes down. Right? So the whole idea behind concentric zone model is that the further you move into the middle, the higher the crime rate. And vice versa, the more you move out, the lower the crime rate. And so this was the argument in terms of how cities were arranged in the early 1900s. Right? The suburbs often had the best places to live, lowest rates of crime, whereas the inner cities were kind of thought of as the bad areas. So don't have to write this down, but these are just some indicators of what a socially disorganized community looks like. And when you hear the term social disorganization, what does that mean? Right? What do we mean about when we say socially disorganized community? What does that mean? What were we taught in our theory classes about social disorganization? Anything? Don't remember? Yeah. So the question is, what do you think of when someone says a socially disorganized community? Or how were you taught to think of it? What does that mean? Maybe not a lot of social gatherings. Maybe residents are not close with one another. They don't talk to one another. Okay. Anything else? Socially disorganized community. We'll come back to that point. But in terms of indicators, right? These were all, or some of the indicators that Sean McKay alluded to that were part of a socially disorganized community, right? Yes, you have high levels of poverty. You have high truancy rates, right? Kids dropping out of school or skipping school. You have large numbers of people who rent houses rather than own houses. Fluctuating populations. You have a continuously people moving in, people moving out, right? It's a big cycle like that. And then you also have large groups of immigrants, black families, or multiple ethnic groups in an area. So what they call racial and ethnic heterogeneity, right? This idea is that people from different cultures, people who speak different languages, who are different from one another, they're not going to interact, right? They're not going to interact and talk to one another and try to solve issues like crime in the community. But one of the differences between social disorganization and other theories of crime, which we should have learned maybe in our crime theory class, is that social disorganization and focus on why certain places, why certain neighborhoods or communities have higher rates of crime, or maybe lower rates of crime. Right? We're not focused on why certain people engage in crime, but why certain places or neighborhoods have more crime than others. So let's think about this. In the future, hopefully in the near future, right, you're going to go out and buy a home. And what are some of the preferences you would have for the community that you want your home to be located in? Okay, so we're talking about the wider community where you want to buy a home, right? What does that look like, or what do you want to see in that community? What do we want in a community? Okay, so we're not talking about the house itself. We're not saying two-car garage, open concept, backyard, nice backyard for grilling. Right? What do we want in the broader community? Yes.
Like low crime.
Low crime is one, of course. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
A good education system.
A good schools. Okay. What else do we want? Feeling safe. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Hiking and walking trails.
Hiking and walking trails, right? So you want an area where the land use is very highly dedicated to recreation. Okay. Awesome. Anything else?
Community engagement.
Social gatherings, and anything from a strong library system, HOA. Yeah, is HOA your conversation?
No.
No. Yeah. They could be good and bad. They could be good and bad. Anything else? Yeah.
I was thinking like shared values about like protecting children.
Shared values about protecting children. Okay. From crime or from delinquency? Anything?
Yeah.
Okay. So we want to make sure, for example, there's not just a bunch of kids running around doing whatever they want, terrorizing the neighborhood, right? Usually when teenagers hang out with one another, on the street corner, that's not a very good thing, right? So I'm telling you about, the house that I used to live in while I was in graduate school. One of the problems we used to have is there was a church located across the street from my house. And whenever there was not any church in session, there was the neighborhood kids, teenagers, that would hang around at the church. And the church itself was kind of located in the middle of the community. So they had a good vantage point where they could kind of see all the way around and see what's going on. And they could see people leaving and going. And that's some of the problems we were having in the neighborhood, is that these unsupervised teenagers would hang out there at the church, and they would watch people leave. And when people would leave, they would go and they'd burglarize their house. Now, we want a community where people would step up and, tell those kids to scram, right? I'd probably use more foul language than that, but, that's kind of the neighbors we want. People that look out for the community, look out for one another. Okay? Anything else? How about close to shopping? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Good? Okay. So, it's good. It could be bad. So, good thing is that if there's shopping centers located in your community, that's pretty good for your neighborhood, your area in general. There's a tax revenue, maybe it's providing some decent jobs for people that live in that community. The flip side is that if you have shopping centers in your community, you can bring in people from outside of the community, right? People who come to those retail centers for criminal purposes, right? So it's kind of like this routine activities where these shopping retailers, yes, they're pro-social, right? They're non-criminal enterprises, but it's bringing in criminal people, it's creating criminal opportunities. So that's something I would be careful about, is specific shopping and shopping centers and retailers wherever you're living. Okay. We're jumping down to the bottom, right? When we talk about social disorganization, right, what's most important is what we call informal social. And it's just like what I mentioned, right? Whenever there's a problem in the community, whenever there's kids getting out of line or kids getting into trouble, we want to make sure that residents in that community, or that we have the trust that residents in that community will regulate the behaviors of community members. Right? That's what informal social control is all about. Sometimes we call this collective efficacy. It's the same thing. It's the trust in your neighbors that they are there to protect you, to look out for your property, for example, and to basically, whenever there's bad stuff going on, to do something about it. So talking about, again, going back to the same neighborhood I used to live in. The final straw for me when I moved out was in the community down the street was the county jail. And then in addition to that, they were going to put the homeless shelter. They were going to move it from kind of the downtown area of the city to the community I was living in, like almost like down the street for me. And I was just like, that's a little too much, right? And so after that is when I moved away and rented the rest of the time I was living there in Tallahassee, Florida. But the idea that the homeless shelter, in my mind, why it was placed there, is because residents in the community didn't have this level of informal social control, right? There wasn't a lot of cohesion in the community to be able to protest placing that homeless shelter in our community, which in my mind didn't really make sense because in most places, homeless shelters are located in downtown or central areas of the city. And we kind of lived in the southwest part of town. So it didn't really make a lot of sense to me other than the county jail was located on the same street. So that's the only part that made sense to me. But that was just kind of like the final straw. And I was just like, you know what? I don't know what's going to happen to this neighborhood after this homeless shelter was in, but I'm going to go ahead and move out. And fortunately, for me, I was able to do that, right? I didn't have any kids. I was able to sell our house and rent the rest of the time. But there was other people that lived there that were great people that just didn't have that same luxury. And just kind of, you want to put this on a map what social disorganization looks like. So there's this idea that places with more concentrated poverty, more racial and ethnic heterogeneity among residents, and more residential mobility, right? People moving in and out of the neighborhood. That's supposed to reduce informal social control, and that increases crime, right? That's kind of like how the argument is typically presented. Oh. Now, time distracted race. So when social disorganization and Sean McKay were writing about these arguments, these ideas, when they were writing these ideas, they were mainly to write about immigrants, right? Immigrants who during that time were being accused of being criminals, right? Having these other deficiencies and things like that. And what Sean McKay said, you know what? Immigrants themselves are not committing crime because actually what they're doing is that they're moving to these poor neighborhoods that have higher rates of crime. But then when they're able to, move up, right, get a job, increase their social economic status, they're able to move out of these communities. And crime didn't follow them whenever they moved. But he said, for blacks specifically, they didn't have these same opportunities. And so when comparing black and white juvenile delinquency rates, Sean McKay writes, the important fact about rates of delinquents for Negro boys is that they too vary by type of area. They are higher than the rates for white boys, but it cannot be said that they are higher than rates for white boys in comparable areas, since it's impossible to reproduce in white communities the circumstances under which Negro children live, even if it were possible to parallel the low economic status and the inadequacy of institutions in the white community, it would not be possible to reproduce the effects of segregation and the barriers to upward mobility, right? Arguing that blacks had higher rates of socioeconomic disadvantage, higher rates of poverty, but also they had, because of racial and discriminatory laws, were often segregated from other groups and had barriers to upward mobility, right? Couldn't obtain certain jobs to help them move out of the communities that they were living in. So since the time of Sean McKay, there's been several books written about how the social circumstances and conditions of communities have changed over time, or how they haven't changed. And so in 1987, William Julius Wilson, who's an African American sociologist at Harvard, wrote this book called The Truly Disadvantaged. And he writes about what's known as industrial restructuring. Right? Prior to World War II and after World War II, the United States had a very strong manufacturing economy, right? We produce steel, we produce automobiles, and we had the growth of cities like Detroit, right? Cities like Cleveland. They were booming cities. But after the 1970s, we start shifting to a service-based economy, and the manufacturing jobs start to decline. All right, now we see that today, right? We see cities like Detroit, cities like Cleveland, Baltimore, that were more once prominent cities, right? They were thriving economically. And now they suffer a lot, right? Because of these loss of manufacturing jobs. And so William Julius Wilson's argument is that when we lost manufacturing jobs, and again, these were often jobs that didn't require a college degree, but they provided a good enough income to achieve the American dream. Now, when we lost these manufacturing jobs, it really devastated black families. It increased poverty levels among African Americans. And then he talks about something else that happened in the 1960s. So 1968, right, we signed the Civil Rights Act. And prior to 1968, racial groups could be segregated legally, right? You could prevent people from buying a house in your neighborhood prior to the 1960s based on their color, based on their religion, and things like that. But after 1968, those laws get abandoned. And now, upper class blacks or middle class blacks are able to move to the suburbs. Prior to the 1960s, they didn't have the same rights, but after 1968, African Americans and other groups could move to more affluent areas. And so William Julius Wilson's argument is that prior to the 1960s, in black community, you had a distribution of both impoverished, middle class, and upper class African Americans. But after 1968, to seek better communities, to seek more opportunities, middle and upper class blacks move out of the inner city, move out of predominantly black communities and into the suburbs. And so what's left is highly segregated black communities that also have high levels of poverty. And what Wilson would argue is that these black middle class individuals, they were kind of like the social buffers, or what he calls the role models, right? You see someone of the same color as you, someone of the same religion. These people who are well off and they're established, they could be seen as role models, right? They can help build some confidence in yourself that, if this person made it, I can make it too. But when these people are gone, what Wilson argues is that what's left as the role models in predominantly African American communities is maybe people involved in criminal activity, involved in drug dealing, and it's those kinds of people that become the role models. And so what remains is what he calls the truly disadvantaged or a black underclass in urban neighborhoods that are socially isolated from mainstream society. Right? So this is Wilson's argument, saying that the loss of manufacturing jobs and black middle class and upper class individuals moving to affluent areas that creates the truly disadvantaged. And so in America today, right, it's well established that most racial groups are racially segregated from one another. Right? Chances are that in the neighborhood or the home you grew up in, on average, probably not true for all of us, but on average, most of the time your neighbors look like you, right? They're the same race, maybe of the same socioeconomic status. It's not going to be true for everyone, but it's true for most people. And so two other books that came out focusing on the role of race, crime, and communities was American Apartheid in 1993 and His Emergent Social World in 2010. So to talk really briefly about what these books discuss, but I want to first play a video talking about racial covenant laws and redlining and how that's impacted African American communities even today. Okay. Warning, the first video I'm going to play has some derogatory language, explicit language, so I just kind of, point that out ahead of time. I can actually get the long source. But nonstop. You know what's Martin Luther King? That's great. And I don't give a fuck what anyone else have. You there's some vibe going down.
Of course, is Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, the stressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in school, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s and the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people, like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working-class families. And red meant detrimental influences, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for red line neighborhoods is the presence of black and brown people. Let's be clear. Studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968. and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39 years of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight.
In the aftermath, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race, religion, or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any US city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that Black families, up and down the income scale, have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were Black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still today much harder for a Black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's a feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, wider neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's the problem. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in Black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything. To hear more about how race shapes American life, visit npr.org.
All right. So this notion of redlining in the 1930s, as you saw at the end of the video, right, across all major U.S. cities in the U.S. during the 1930s, there were maps that identified which neighborhoods banks should invest in or which neighborhoods banks should grant home mortgages to. And that's probably the number one indicator in terms of the quality of a neighborhood, is the percentage of people in that community that own their home, right? So whenever you go out and buy your home, try to buy it in a home, or try to buy it in a community where there's a high rate of home ownership. Usually when there's renters living nearby, right, they're not going to have that same stake in the community. They're not going to, keep up their house as nicely as, say, someone who actually owns their home, right? So home ownership is a big indicator in terms of the quality of the community. And this notion of redlining that happened in the 1930s, right? Those red areas, which tended to be areas with lower class whites, blacks, and immigrants, tended to be places that had the least amount of investment because they were designated as too risky. But this idea of redlining, or this practice of redlining, I should say, still has impacts today, right? What we see in criminological studies is that places that were labeled as red or risky areas in the 1930s, even today have the higher rates of violence, higher rates of firearm homicides, things like that. So these laws that are historical in nature still have present day implications, still continue to impact people who are living in those communities today. Also, in the book, Massey and Denton and American Apartheid talk about this notion of hypersegregation. Right? Yes, people of different racial and ethnic groups are segregated in terms of where they live, but that segregation also translates to differences in health outcomes, right? Differences in the quality of the schools they attend, and so forth. Right? So it's not just a matter of being segregated in terms of where you live, but it's also what you're exposed to, schools you can attend when you're growing up. Okay. Most recently in 2010, I'm not going to go too much into this book. It's called Divergent Social World. And in this book, Pearson and Grebo collect crime data on neighborhoods. I think it's about 9,000 neighborhoods across nearly 90 cities in the US in the year 2000. And to get crime data at the neighborhood level is really, really hard and difficult. It's tedious, right? I can get crime data for Houston, Dallas, San Francisco like that, right? It's really easy. Just go to UCR's website. But to get crime data for neighborhoods within San Francisco or neighborhoods within Houston is very, very hard to do. It's a very tedious practice. But they collect these data, and they also look at the racial and ethnic makeup of neighborhoods. And so what they find is that there's only 5 types of neighborhoods across their sample of 90 cities. You have white, you have black, and you have Latino neighborhoods, right? That's 3 out of the 5. And the rest are going to be minority neighborhoods, which minority neighborhoods basically means a combination of both black and Latino. And then integrated neighborhoods. Integrated neighborhoods meaning that there's just like a diversity of white, black, Asian, Native Americans living in that neighborhood. Right? So you have white, you have black, you have Latino, and then you have minority and integrated neighborhoods. Right? And their argument, those are the only types of neighborhoods that exist in America. And what they argue is that being racially segregated and living specifically for minority groups like blacks and Latinos, living in communities with high levels of disadvantage, exposes them to differences in crime or violent behavior. The communities they live in have higher levels of poverty, and that explains why these groups have higher levels of criminal and violent behavior. In terms of economic disadvantage or poverty, that's probably one of the strongest predictors of crime. If you're doing research and you're looking at community differences in crime, overwhelmingly economic disadvantage is probably going to have the strongest effect on criminal behavior. And in their argument, what they're saying is that when you throw in race, you throw in community disadvantage in a model, a statistical model, what it's going to show is that when you include economic disadvantage in the model, race becomes insignificant. race doesn't matter once you control for economic disadvantage in terms of the causes or predictors of crime. So again, right, racial invariance thesis really making the argument that the effects of disadvantage on crime are the same across race and ethnicity. And because blacks and Latinos have higher rates of crime, it's viewed because these groups live in communities with higher levels of poverty. Well, I appreciate you coming in. I know it's raining outside. Hopefully you get caught into it or caught into that. So for this week, what we're going to do is we're going to finish off the lecture today. We have maybe about 10, 12 slides somewhere around there, at least on my end, it's about 7, 12 slides to finish up. And then we'll be done for the day. So maybe about 45 minutes or so in terms of class time, not too long. And then on Thursday, what we'll do is we'll launch a documentary video. So from last time, what we're talking about is structural characteristics associated with different minority groups, right? So when we say structural characteristics, we're not talking about the communities that different groups live in. And it's well known fact that in America, racial groups live in different communities, right? On average, your neighbor is someone that looks like you, right? Same race, maybe the same social status, things like that. Not like always, but on average, that's typically how it works in society. And the communities you grow up in have a really profound impact on your life outcomes, right? Your community kind of dictates, whether or not you're exposed to violence, the quality of schools you grow up, other resources like libraries, YMCAs located in your communities, right? Those have really, important implications in terms of your life outcome. So from last time, what we first talked about was that social disorganization, in terms of how we're applying it to race and ethnicity, argues that minority groups, especially blacks and Latinos, grow up in communities with much higher levels of economic disadvantage, much higher levels of poverty, and those things translate to higher levels of crime or exposure to violence. Also, what we know in terms of other books that have been written about communities, especially minority communities, we know that practices like redlining, right? These are these 1930s practices were based primarily loaned money to places that were considered to be more advantaged or less risky. Those places were often white areas and excluded black areas and low-class white areas. And so these historical practices continue to impact these communities today. And then one thing I definitely want you to know is this racial invariance thesis, which we talked about last time. The argument with the racial invariance thesis is that it's economic disadvantage or differences in communities, particularly in terms of poverty, that explains why there's differences in crime across racial and ethnic groups, right? It's not their race per se that explains differences in crime. It's the communities they grow up in, more specifically, their exposure to economic disadvantage. Right? So the argument for social disorganization is that economic disadvantage is a driver explained why minority groups have higher rates of crime. A limitation to that is what's known as the immigrant/Latino paradox. So if we make this argument that economic disadvantage is bad and that it increases rates of crime in communities with more poverty, the outlier is that if immigrants or communities have more immigrants, typically what we see is that they have lower rates of crime. Even though immigrants, on the most part, not all immigrants, but many immigrants would be considered poor or from a lower socioeconomic background. But any community, doesn't matter if it's a community with black immigrants, with white immigrants, with Latino immigrants, tend to have substantially lower levels of crime, even if those same communities have higher levels of disadvantage. And this here is a picture of Little Haiti in Miami, Florida. And some possible explanations to what we call the immigrant revitalization theory, right? There's this argument that immigrants are more attached to the economy. Immigrants, even undocumented immigrants, have higher levels of employment. On average, immigrants are more likely to open a new business relative to a native-born person. And so there's this argument that more immigrants are associated with economic vitality, and that in itself is what reduces crime. So when we think of it on the surface, right, immigrants, even if they're here legally, immigrants have an incentive to refrain from criminal behavior, right? You're an immigrant, regardless if you're documented or undocumented. You're vulnerable to deportation if you're arrested and come into contact with the criminal justice system, right? So this fear of deportation, this strong attachment to the economy, is some of the reasons we think, we can't prove it for sure, but what we think white communities with more immigrants have less of. And so this is kind of an outlier, right? Kind of a limitation to this argument that economic disadvantage in the community increases crime. Because immigrants, for the most part, most of them tend to be poor, but places with more immigrants typically have lower levels of crime. Also down here, as we talked about this at the class times previously, that more immigrants over time have been associated, correlated with a decrease in violent crime. So the U.S. as a whole, right, increases in immigration have been correlated with decreases in violent crime. And when we apply this to cities, we tend to see that cities over time that experience more immigrant growth have also experienced decreases in criminal behaviors. So moving away from the social disorganization perspective, right? So social disorganization is focused on structural characteristics, namely economic disadvantage. Strain and anomy theory, here we're talking about block opportunity, right? Block opportunities in regards to education and employment. So there's various theories related to strain or anomy, but the most popular one and the original one is this one written by Robert K. Burton. And this idea came out in 1938. And in 1938, right, this is in the midst of the Great Depression, high rates of poverty, high levels of unemployment. I think unemployment levels were about 25% during this period. And on average, we typically see unemployment levels today about 4 or 5%. So strain theory itself, the idea behind strain theory, is aligned with the work of Emile Durkheim, who was a sociologist who lived in France during the late 1800s. And Durkheim really talked about how norms and being involved in the community really helps regulate behaviors. So when you feel attached to a community, when you abide by group norms, that is what helps people stay away from crime, right? So Durkheim and strain theory is really talking about group norms and attachment to those norms. So in terms of strain theory, the norm that Burton is talking about is this culturally defined goal, right? And it's still, I would argue, it's a norm that most of us know about and maybe abide by today. And it's the pursuit of the American dream. Right? In U.S. society, there's this idea that if you go to school, that if you work hard, save up money, you can achieve the American dream. People's version of the American dream really differs, but maybe we can think of the American dream as being able to afford buying your own home, a car, raising a family, things like that. So string theory argues that there's this norm around the American dream. Everyone's trying to pursue it, everyone's trying to live up to it. But the norm also suggests that there's acceptable ways of achieving that dream. Okay? And again, that would be education and hard work. Right? The idea is if you, again, work hard, you go to school, you kind of delay gratification, right? Go to school in order to earn a better job, that you'll be able to make more money over time. So there's these acceptable means of achieving the American dream, right? So there's the norm, which is the American dream, and then there's also acceptable ways of achieving it. That's the argument of string theory. Now, applying it to race, Merton argued that all groups, right, whether we're immigrants, whether we're Latinos, or we're whites or blacks, we all try to live up to the American dreams. But for some groups, and again, right, this we're talking in the 1930s, he's saying for some groups, especially blacks, there's this glass ceiling, right? Meaning that blacks don't have the same opportunities as whites or other groups to achieve the American dream. That for blacks, they are excluded from some types of jobs, specifically jobs that provide better wages and more money. Right, so the argument here is that blacks adhere to the same goal, meaning the American dream, but lack the acceptable means to achieve that goal. And again, right, you got to think about the context when Merton was writing this. It's the 1930s, right? This is an era of segregation, Jim Crow. There was definitely discrimination going on in the employment force. Definitely blocked opportunities for blacks in the 1930s. So what's the alternative, right? And so the argument is that when you have this goal, but you have these blocked opportunities, what that does is it creates strains, right? You're strained because you want to achieve the American dream, but you can't get jobs in order to make better money, or earn a better living. So what happens? You turn to illegitimate means, meaning crime, to try to achieve the American dream. So trained in the context here is really talking about how minority groups, they have higher rates of crime because they're more likely to be blocked from legitimate opportunities to achieve the American dream. Some limitations of theory is that string theory assumes that most or even all criminal behaviors are income motivated, which is not necessarily true, right? Other crimes like domestic violence, sexual assault, even, are often not income motivated. Also, when you read stories online, right? I'm sure most of us, I get this perception is that people really commit crime, hurt other people, for really like stupid stuff, right? So a lot of crimes are not income motivated. Some are, of course, like robbery and burglary, larceny, of course. But not all crimes are income motivated. Also, what explains white collar crime? Right? The assumption is that if you achieve the American dream, you're not going to engage in criminal behavior. Well, white collar criminals, for the most part, are people who are very educated, are people who have achieved the American dream, right? They often have high levels of income. What causes them to engage in criminal behavior. So here's another version of string theory, perhaps the most recent one. It's often referred to as general string theory, which was written in 1990 by Bob Agnew. And so one thing I forgot to mention with Merton's string theory, because it's talking about society group norms, we typically think of it as a macro level theory, right? So Merton's theory is typically assumed to be a macro theory. But general string theory is more looking at the individual aspect of string. It's something what most of us would assume strain is, right? When we think of strain, we often think of stress, and that is really what Bob Agnew is talking about. So I won't get too much into it, but string theory really focuses on the loss of positive stimuli, right? Losing out on something that makes you feel good, or the introduction of negative stimuli, which we often think of as stress or strain. So for string theory, it's really about how we respond to strain and stress. Right? All of us are going to go through life experiencing some sort of strain and stress, but it's how we deal with it that is key, according to general string theory. Overall, it doesn't really get a lot of empirical support, but one important thing that's been mentioned in the theory, especially in regards to race, is that racial discrimination itself can be a cause of crime. And racial discrimination is often thought of as a negative stimuli. And there's been some research documenting this, that among Blacks and Latinos, those who have experienced racial discrimination or who have perceived experienced racial discrimination are more likely to engage in criminal behavior. One, the culture of violence. This one's also a macro level argument. And so where Merton's string theory argues that everyone wants to pursue the American dream, right? That's a society norm that most people adhere to. Subculture violence theory argues that, you know what, there's some people in society that really don't care about the American dream. Right? They're not interested in getting a job. They're not interested in going to school. They're not interested in owning a home, raising a family, things like that. Rather, these people are perfectly okay with engaging in violence. That for them, a violent act or committing a violent act does nothing to their ethics or their morals, right? They could commit violence, hurt other people, and it doesn't matter to them. So the subculture of violence theory was introduced by Marvin Wolfgang and Francisco Ferragutti in the late 1960s. Wolfgang was a big deal in criminology. The idea of the age crime curve, the idea that a very small portion of the population account for a large percentage of violent crimes, that was all research done under Wolfgang. The subculture of violence theory, according to Wolfgang, is age graded. means that people who are more likely to feel ill will or guilt towards committing violent acts tend to be people who are teenagers or younger adults. Or maybe people who haven't developed brain capacity, haven't developed the moral to know that violence or hurting other people is wrong. Alright, so subculture violence theory, in a nutshell, argues that there's a small portion of the population that believe that violence is perfectly okay.
Can you go back?
Yeah, can we go back? Sure. So subcultural violence theory came out in 1967. And nearly 30 years later, or over 30 years later, in 1999, Elijah Anderson came out with this book called Code of the Streets. It really built on Wolfgang and Ferrafutti's work. And both Wolfgang and Anderson did their work, their research in Philadelphia. And Anderson does a much better job than Ferrafutti and Wolfgang in applying this theory, this idea to race. So for Anderson's argument of the Code of the Street is that when you live in a disadvantaged neighborhood, you often don't have a lot of opportunities. You often don't have much to live for. And you really have little in terms of possessions and other things that might be of economic value. Right? So Anderson's arguing that for people living in the inner city, which often are minority groups, the outlook on life is bleak. Right? There's really, again, not a lot to live for. What they have, or one of the only things they have, is their image and self-respect. And so the idea of the Code of the Street is that when someone has disrespected you, the Code of the Street maintains that you use violence to retain or get your respect back. So for Anderson, inner city violence is all about people trying to guard their respect, trying to get their respect back. And so it's why, little, things that might be just a small argument really turn up or explode into a violent incident. So we'll play a short video where Anderson's here in Philadelphia and he's talking about the Code of the Street and some of his ideas. Oh, that's the Atlantic article.
Just evidence. Crime alienation. Civil law in the lives of people becomes weaker and weaker. The Code of the Street becomes more and more prominent. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. And when the civil laws leave, street justice oftentimes slips them away. Tell me your story. My son, your story. The story of the young man in the urban environment, his perspective is oftentimes missing from any discussion.
We grew up in a family of four. Like, my brother was in and out of the streets and stuff like that. My mom was there as much as she could. She worked, but she also had her habits. Like, drinking and stuff like that would make it harder for the kids.
For you to be your age and me to learn, I've probably seen a little more than you.
Yeah.
On a violent perspective.
We met at the stop sign on the street 3 weeks ago. It's a self-described entrepreneur. Whatever you can sell to make money.
As far as seeing people get shot, watching dead bodies lie on the ground, seeing friends of mine die off, It was either kill or be killed now.
In the community, the people have themselves up the street decent. And probably Mustafa, however he was raised, he had access to the street. And that experience has created him a deep sense of alienation.
Anything can happen at any given time.
But his dream is about decency. Decency.
You know, you only get cash two ways. I always tell folks. Legal businesses, you own, operate your own business, or you work for someone, or illegal, where you do drug trades or steal whatever. Those are the two ways you make money in this country when you break it down.
Drugs are everywhere, and guns are everywhere. It's easy to get drugs. Like you go to any corner, always get drugs. I always stand in the corner, sell drugs. Like, oh yeah, I'm proud of this. Yeah, look at me, I do this. It's just literally a way of life. What country? It's trying to look for it. If you're doing it right, you can make like $1,500 a day.
Man, if you're a man and you feel no hope, you sense no future, you become destroyed as a person, then you don't care what happens to you. If you don't care what happens to you, you certainly don't care about people around
Now respect. No. You have to be respected. You have to be you have to be respected.
Street credibility is essential. And street cred is high maintenance.
In the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the city of Philadelphia, we had gang killing. Yeah. This violence now is a whole other kind of level violence. I mean, most of the homicides in the city of Philadelphia for the last 10 years or so have been argument related. Guys are frustrated.
What are the fights about?
Most of the fights are bullying about nothing. About nothing.
Stuff like me and you talking now, we disagree.
You can look at somebody's girl wrong.
It escalates and it escalates. You're packing and I'm packing. Somebody's gonna get shot.
A lot of people say the fight is going out. Fist fighting. People gain reputations for having the ability and inclination to pay back in kind. Payback, revenge. How easy is it to get a gun?
A phone call and a couple hours. All you need is money. You got the little green dead people want a piece of paper and you can get whatever you want.
So I ain't going to fight. I'm just going to shoot you.
The code of the street is a peculiar form of social exchange that allows for a certain order in the community. It's even something of that. It's a policing mechanism, one might say. It's not pretty as a picture, but this is one of the ways in which the community functions, we say.
Cross the street, get the fuck out the street.
Not a lot of respect for the police in the community.
If somebody broke into my house, I would go grab a gun and start shooting before I call the police.
The code of the street is that you don't call the police because you sell it yourself. They don't trust the police. They don't trust the system because perhaps they had an experience in the past where they did do the right thing and then work out to exactly how they looked at it.
Respond to gun call, taking 5 hours to get there for that. But you tell them somebody on the corner selling a bag of weed, here it come. 50 cars deep. But you tell them somebody laying there dying, take the cop 4 hours to get there. This guy done been shot 4 times. He laying on the ground. Is he breathing? Why are you asking me questions? Didn't I just say the man been shot 4 times? Why not rush and find out if he's breathing or not?
It's the wrong mindset. We all know that. But how do you get into a mind of a juvenile or a young adult and tell them, do the right thing?
Would it be different in a white neighborhood?
Of course it would. You get a response.
It's so prevalent. The Civil War comes into play.
One of the people are talking in the last 4 or 5 years is that a lot of young folks really don't want to be going as crazy as what we go. They just don't have someone showing them how to do something different. So you become a creature of your mind. Because you got to survive.
I can't keep talking about I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. I can't say I own a car dealership. If I don't get some money, ain't no money gonna come in. You gotta kill somebody to survive. You gotta rob somebody. Surviving right now is hard.
And I think this really gets right at America's racial
All right. So the argument here is that inner city communities, especially minority inner city communities, there's different value systems. And in this community, the one that Anderson is studying in inner city Philadelphia, it's code of the street. Right? And again, all issues of violence, or at least most in inner city communities, according to Anderson, revolve around issues regarding respect. So in his argument, social life is really dominated by this code of the street and wanting to maintain one's respect. Now, it's just clear in his book that both decent people, meaning decent people who want to live up to the American dream, who respect their elders, who go to school, who do the right thing, right? Those make up the majority of the people in the community. A scholar named David Kennedy who does a lot of work in this inner city violent community. And his argument is that in the most violent communities, most violent places in the United States, hardly anyone is violent. That violence itself is really dominated by a small subset of the population. So you have decent families, and then you have street families. Right? Street families are those where elders or parents teach their kids, hey, you got to toughen up. Hey, don't let this person or that person disrespect you. If someone does, you got to fight him or her. So for street family, right, they teach their children at a very young age about the code of the street and trying to maintain love and respect. Now, according to Anderson, even the decent kids, the decent families will abide by the code of the street mentality because the argument is that if you don't follow this code of the street practice, then even if you're a decent person, you're going to be victimized, you're going to be bullied in the neighborhood. So even for the decent kids, following this code of the street mentality, trying to act tough, is a way to prevent victimization. And so in Anderson's mind, decent people are often code switching, right? They're code switching from being decent families, living up to the American dream, doing this kind of stuff. But when they're out in the streets, when they're out in the public, hey, maybe someone's going to test them. Maybe they got to act tough. Maybe if someone runs their mouth, talks a little smack, they have to talk back, right? So social life really dictates, or social life is dictated by this code of the street mentality, and it affects both decent people and street people. So I got one final story about the community I used to live in when I was in grad school, which I would argue had kind of this code of the street mentality, right? There were some people there that were really about this persona of acting tough. And I think I talked about last time where across the street from my house there was a church and there was always these neighborhood kids, often teenagers, that would hang out, right? I think I told you that story. So I remember one time I was studying an exam. You have to take these exams before you can go into the dissertation phase of graduate school. So I was studying for these exams, and I heard the FedEx guy coming to my door. I was expecting a package that afternoon, but I was in the middle of studying, and I had a timer going and everything. And so I was like, I have 10 minutes, I'll be good. I'll get the package in about 10 minutes. So 10 minutes comes, I go to the front door, open the door, see there's no package. Look across the street, see the teenagers hanging out there. They're like, these motherfuckers are good. Okay, so I walk across the street. I won't tell you this next part, but really kind of chewed them out for it. And I may not have had a handcuff. That's all I'll say about that. But my whole thinking during this time was like, I'm not going to let these guys get away with it. my whole attitude is to try to act tough so they won't try that shit again, right? And when I was walking up to them, right, there's a group of kids, and I was walking up to them. One of the kids took off, so I was like, "It was that motherfucker that did it." So, I lay it to them and I tell them, "Bring me back my package," and I walk back home. Later, I got my package. They came and they dropped off the package. It was like something my wife needed for school, so it wasn't anything of value. It was for her kids, even like her students. But the next time I saw the kid that ran away, I chewed him out again. And and for me, it was all about trying to maintain this persona of respect, trying to intimidate them so they don't do that again. And the rest of the time I was living there, I think we were only living in the house for about six months or so after that incident. But there was always a worry about whether or not they were going to come back or try it again. I made sure they knew I had a gun, and so I was hoping that was going to be enough to discourage them from ever trying anything like that again. But I felt like in that community, that was kind of something I had to do. I never called the cops. I felt like in order to protect my home, to protect myself, I had to chew into these kids and let them know that they can't be doing it. But in some communities, people feel like they have to maintain that way of life or that way of thinking, and it's really like an ugly way to live. Like you never want to feel like, hey, I need to be tough to try to discourage someone from potentially victimizing me. So the code of the street. What argument or limitation is, where does this come from, right? You have this code of the street mentality. What causes it, right? Anderson is arguing that it's their level of disadvantage and lack of opportunities, right? The outlook of life is bleak. There's really not much to live for. So that's what in Anderson's view causes this code of the street. Others say that it's not really coming from the streets per se, but from prison, right? When you think of a correctional setting or a prison setting, this wanting to maintain one's respect is really, reminiscent of how life is like in prison settings. So there's this argument that the code of the street doesn't really come from the streets, it comes from prisons. And then when you think about it too, most ex-prisoners are returning back to communities like this, right? Communities that are in the inner city, most of them are minorities. Others argue that the code of the street is not really about a norm or a culture. It's this idea about legal cynicism. So the definition for legal cynicism is listed right here. It's a belief that the legal system and law enforcement are ineffective and illegitimate. So there was one guy in the video who said, people don't really call the cops. And one of the reasons why they don't call the cops maybe because they had called the cops on a previous occasion, but when they called the cops, the incident didn't work out the way they wanted it to, right? And so some people might think that, if I call the cops, they're not going to do anything about it. So it's up to me to do it myself, right? I don't have any belief that the legal system or law enforcement is going to take care of the problem, so I'm going to do it myself, right? That's what legal cynicism is all about. And legal cynicism itself is a concept that's really discussed when we talk about racial attitudes and police contact. All right. So here's the last argument. It's not really a theory, but it's an argument that's relatively new. It was introduced in this book called Freakonomics. Has anyone ever read this book? Yeah? Yeah. You ever read some of the chapters, like the way that they were titled?
I don't know about it. I read it freshman year.
Freshman year? Yeah. Or did you read it for like an economics class or? But they talk a lot about different human behaviors. Let me see if I can pull up the book really quick. What do school teachers and sumo wrestlers have in common? The next one, chapter 2, is how is the Ku Klux Klan like a group of real estate agents, right? So that's probably talking about housing discrimination. But in the book, they're talking a lot about different social phenomenon. They explain it in a way that's very, very funny to read. This one's my favorite. Chapter 3. Why do drug dealers still live with their mom? Really funny title, book. If you ever have the chance to read it, it was a New York Times bestseller back in 2001. And the book itself is not written by criminologists. Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner are both economists. And there's some economists that talk about crime or do studies on crime. But their argument is that why we started experiencing a decrease in crime in the 1990s was because of abortion legislation that was passed initially in 1973 under Roe v. Wade. And they make a very strong argument, right? They're saying that 50%, half of the violent crime drop that's occurred since the 1990s was due to the Roe v. Wade decision that at the time legalized abortion. Now the question here is, how is it that a policy decision made in 1973 impacts crime nearly 20 years later? Any guesses? What's the phenomenon that explains this gap? Or the reason why there is a gap? In research, we call this a lag effect, right? It's not an immediate effect that's coming after the policy, it's coming later down the road. What's causing the phenomenon? Well established in criminology that for individuals, right, most of criminal offending is going to be done during the teenage and young adult years. So the reason why we saw this delayed effect was because of the age crime curve. Because for most individuals, that's when you see them commit crime. So here's their argument. And again, right, this is their argument, it's not mine. And I'm not advocating for abortion or against abortion. The argument is, first, that abortion is going to reduce the number of kids. But specifically, they're arguing that people who get abortions, or that abortions themselves, reduce the number of kids who would grow up in homes with trauma, a lack of socialization, or parental neglect. Right? Their argument is that for most people, not all people, but for most people who have abortions, they really don't want children. And so if they were forced to have children, they wouldn't treat their children right. They wouldn't be good parents, good role models. And applying it to race, Levitt and Dubner argue that minorities, specifically Black and Latinos, are more likely than whites to get an abortion. And so that's why we saw drops in crime for not just whites, Blacks, but also Latinos. But because it occurred more among Blacks and Hispanics, we saw crime rates for those groups drop more relative to whites. In terms of this abortion argument, there's been some studies on it, right? Some studies support it, but I would argue that the best studies show that abortion had no effect on the violent crime. Right? That's my interpretation of the evidence, but it definitely is a plausible argument that they're making. It's just that there's really no empirical data to support it. So overall this week, we talked about various theories for why there are differences in crime across groups. Early theories primarily focus on differences in biology or intelligence or IQ, whereas other ones talk about differences in communities per se.